Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this space. Welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. And I am the Minister of Lifelong Learning, Reverend Jay Hooper. If you have never been to First Unitarian Society, I'd love to welcome you again and just let you know that we are a member congregation from the Unitarian Universalist Association. And you can catch us online, you can catch us here, and anywhere that you feel best comfortable, even if you got to open up your cell phones, as I say. But in this place, we are focused as a humanist congregation where our values and our beliefs are rooted in justice, love with compassion, a commitment to democracy, and most of all, right relationship. We are here to offer each other a wellness of commitment between community and also beyond belief, radical thinking. So I invite you today, I'm so excited to have this program that Mickey has put on. So this is a great opportunity for the First Unitarian Society and the Women's Press to join together to create this special program around the Black Women in Mental Health Forum. Thank you so much. Here you go, Mickey.
By the way, Jay had his talk today about revolutionary mothering, which was largely about the fact that we're not here to bring people to the existing mothership, but to create a revolutionary way of mothering that we're working on. So that was coincidental, by the way. We did not plan the nice overlap between that and today's noon forum. So welcome, everybody. We'll have people coming in also from the social hour downstairs, and I know we've got a live stream audience as well. I'm just going to say a couple quick things and then bring the panelists, if we call you that, up to have a conversation with Andrea Pierre, who's going to come up from KRSM and moderate the conversation. I also want to welcome Alexis Yaboa, who has done a couple conversations with them previously for our magazine. And it all kind of started because back in January or February, Dr. Catherine Squires wanted to write a column about what was happening in academia. We'd already seen some things in the news, and there were things not in the news, and wanted to write a column. And she's with the African American Leadership Forum now, and Adair gave me a call and said, "Can we talk to you?" And if Adair leaves me a message, I call him right back. Said yes. So Catherine wrote a column for us, and within 2 weeks it had 2,000 readers around the country because it was resonating all over the place. And that's pretty good for us in 2 weeks. It even had more hits than our homepage, so it was quite something. It resonated, and then we got quite a few letters afterwards, and then we invited Alexis to write a deeper story that was the cover of our May issue on mental health. And then we also put things in motion to do a forum, and I tend to do forums here whenever possible in events because we can both live stream with Jacob's help, and we can record it for video, turn it into another story. He also has audio that Andrea will use for KRSM from this conversation. So just trying to find more ways to amplify and escalate the conversations. And I want to just thank, again, African American Leadership Forum, who is a co-sponsor of this event, along with the University of Minnesota Press. They have Ty's book out there, and we are grateful for the fact that University of Minnesota Press has actually helped us have a tremendous amount of great voices in our magazine over the years. They have a very good book list that continues to be great. So. Does everyone, you want to all come up? And then, Andrea, I'll have you kind of kick off the conversation. We have about an hour. We'll give a moment to see if we can have Q&A at the end, but I know there's a lot to unpack and talk about. So.
So good afternoon. I hope everyone's having a good day. Want to thank Minnesota Women's Press, African American Leadership Forum, and First Universalist Church for the warm welcome. Also want to thank our esteemed panel today. Just want to start off with introducing everyone, and we'll start from everyone to my right, stage right, I guess. We have Dr. Tayon Coleman, and whose book is out there in the lobby, or you can get it anywhere, I'm sure. Traveling Without Moving, Essays from a Black Woman Trying to Survive in America. And Dr. Coleman, you have a mic right there next to you. But I know you are a professor of literature and language and writing and women's studies, and you're at St. Kate's, you're Katie. And is there anything else that you want us to know, like in your introduction about yourself?
I'm a mom and just happy to be here and trying to figure it out. Just so honored to be here with you all and with my two colleagues here. Thank you, and thank you.
Yeah. And then we have Dr. Rachel Hardiman, tenure professor, researcher, director of Center for Anti-Racism and Research and Health Equity, recently named, and we should applaud, Time's 100 most influential people in the world, y'all. Just doing the great work, also an advocate for Black maternal health. Anything else that you would want us to know about you, Dr. Hardiman?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I think the only other thing I would add is, like Dr. Coleman here, I'm a mom. My daughter Layla is in the audience, and so much, or I would say all of the work that I do is to make the world a little bit or a lot better for Layla. Happy to be here.
And last but certainly not least, Dr. Catherine Squires, whose essay in the Minnesota Women's Press that really kind of was the spark that inspired this conversation. So thank you for that. And, you know, sorry that we are still here and we're still going through this as Black women. But you are a writer, educator, yoga practitioner as well, and you also recently retired from the University of Minnesota, and you work with a lot of local organizations and authors and do a lot of great work in community as well. But anything else you want us to know about you, Dr. Squires?
Well, thanks for having me back again here, and thank you for moderating our panel, and thank you all for saying yes to this, because, you know, we all are in this together. And I think one of the things that's most troubling still about what's happening to Black women, no matter what field they're in, is the isolation. And so I'm really happy to be here with two of my colleagues and friends who are not just surviving, but also starting to thrive. And I think that's the picture that we need to see more of, and we need to make it possible for more people. So thanks for being part of this.
So just thank you again, panel, and if we can all give them a round of applause for being here. So as I read your book, Dr. Coleman, and I've been following your work as well, Dr. Hardiman, and reading your essay and learning more about you as well, Dr. Squires, I'm noticing that there's a theme in all of your work about being the only Black woman in your work, or being highly visible but invisible. I'm wondering about the pressure and how isolating it is and how painful that can be. And if you all can just kind of tell me or give us advice about how do you navigate this stress and stay grounded and avoid the landmines that, you know, do happen in work like this? Anyone can go first.
Go ahead.
I'll go first and know that I qualify everything I'm going to say and write with that I'm still trying, right? I statements for me.
Yeah.
I think the initial way was just to write and to tell my story. And writing for me has always been a way to make sense of the world. But also, I think if you can, try to find community. Are there people that you work with that you can have validate you? And then if not, figure out what it is that makes you feel good. Sometimes it's a playlist, right? Sometimes it might be an extreme Kendrick Lamar, or it might, go back to Queen Latifah. Whatever it is you can to do to bring yourself joy, for you not to let that isolation become your reality, because it's easy for it to become the sun and you can't see anything around it, and find a way to create the realities that reflect who you are and your identity and your intersectional self and what gives you joy and happiness. And it's not always easy. I would say it's a practice, but figuring out constantly how to serve and feed yourself and put yourself first, because if you don't do that, then you can't be good to anyone else, like your children and your loved ones in your circle. But most importantly, don't be hard on yourself. Don't take it out on you. And that's where I would start.
I'm going to start by saying first, my anything I share in this space is mine and not representative of my employer or the Center for Anti-Racism Research for Health Equity at the University of Minnesota. I am also a work in progress. This past year, this is exactly, the question that you just posed is exactly the one I've been grappling with personally, probably longer than a year, but very much in the past year, it's at the forefront. I think the isolation is real and it's intentional, right? Because we don't get much done alone. And for me, I am, a tenured professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota. And I was the second Black professor hired on the tenure track in the school. The first one was hired almost 30 years prior to my entrance into the faculty. And so for nearly 30 years, there was one who was incredibly, obviously very isolated. And then I came along, and it's been a journey. It's been incredibly hard. I have been able to lead some of the change. Now there are 4 incredible Black female faculty in my department. But going at it alone, I have a colleague at the University of Washington who says it's actually unethical to be an only, and it is a failure of our systems and our institutions. And the way I've navigated that is, it has not been perfect. Oftentimes it has driven me to write. It has driven me to try to get my thoughts and my pain and my questions on paper. I'll never forget in 2016, after Philando Castile was killed by a police officer, I was sitting in my office at the University of Minnesota, devastated. And, not because I knew Philando personally, but because, for me, it was another loss of someone in our community and another life that was ended too soon. And I remember all of my colleagues sort of buzzing around in the hallways as though sort of nothing had happened and, just business as usual, and going into a faculty meeting and folks being like, well, what's wrong with you? And not having anyone to turn to or to look at or to say, even a knowing glance or a hug, nothing. And so I used that moment to write and to share what I thought was, and still think is, the responsibility of all of us to take on these big issues like dismantling inequities and dismantling racism. And so I put a lot of it into my work. But what I've realized, I think, over the past couple of years is that's not enough, and that can only get you so far if you don't intentionally surround yourself with community, with people who love you, and what I've learned is it's not the people within the academy, it's not the people who I'm working with daily, it's the folks outside of that space who see me, who love me, who pick me up and tell me it's gonna be okay and are always cheering for me.
Not much I can add to all that. Retweet, as they say. The young people say that.
That part. That part.
I would say just to put a bow on top, helping other people see how to analyze from a systems level versus an individual level is really important, because too often, the only is lionized as a path breaker and all these sorts of things. And of course those things are true. Like, we want to give people their props for doing amazing work. And at the same time, we've normalized us being the onlys, where everybody else has a squad. And that is just not fair. Humans are social creatures. We need community, and we need community in all parts of our lives. And so the forced bifurcation of our lives and the expectation of assimilation is still so present and so brutal. And that is where I think I would direct people's attention, is that that's not on us. Right? I was in a conversation, and a wonderful person who works in state government said, they recruit for diversity and then they onboard for assimilation. And that needs to change. That needs to change.
I love that. And I just feel like the tax, like on your mental health, being Black and being a successful role model, no matter the cost to your own well-being, like you're on a pedestal, because you are doing like fantastic work. But it is a lot of stress because you feel like you have to be perfect or seem so, and no one can truly be perfect. We know this, right? Black girl magic, Black exceptionalism, strong Black women trope, it's just hard to do that. And I think you all get asked often like what you think, but I am interested in how you feel, We've went through an uprising, we've gone through COVID, but how do you feel today? And I'm gonna go kick it back to you, Dr. Squires, if you don't mind. You were looking at me and giving me eye contact.
I need to stop doing that. It gets me in trouble. So, how do I feel? I feel simultaneously very hopeful and determined, but also tired. I think the events of 2020 showed people a lot and opened the door for lots of conversations, but I'm also dismayed that right now it seems like a lot of that is shutting down out of fear. So lots of promises were made in 2020 to do better, and now that a few lawsuits have been filed, against universities, against venture capital projects to try and get more Black folks into the game. And we're not even talking about changing the game, just getting people into the game, right? All of that is under fire in a way that, we haven't seen since the early first attacks on affirmative action and things like this. So it's been a pretty constant rollback. And at the same time, I think I see young people especially, and some co-conspirators, some of whom are in the House, who are bringing things into the public domain with much more unapologeticness, without all the caveats, just saying, no, this isn't working. We saw it didn't work. We saw a complete collapse in 2020. We saw that the idea that the only thing that matters is profit and efficiency is not how to make a safe, healthy, thriving world. Right? We need to stop treating people as disposable. Because it hurt everyone. It hurt some people more than others, but it hurt everyone. And I hope that that shift in mindset to talking about how do we base a society on care versus profit and competition, that is a conversation that I think is getting stronger. That makes me have hope.
Thank you.
My one-word answer to that question is I feel weary. And for all of the reasons that Dr. Squires just described. And I think we've learned a lot since 2020, and yet the weariness comes from the fact that we are still not willing to be creative and innovative and do things differently based on what's happened over the past several years and those lessons we've learned. And for me, what I've seen sitting in, you know, an academic position is that the status quo, right, continues to sort of just keep the machine moving along as it was designed. And so rather than take those learnings or decide that we want to see the humanity in every single human being and do something different, we continue to fall back on what's sort of been the easiest. And so fighting those fights, and even, you know, I agree, like there's these incredible sort of young folks who are, you know, trying to push those boundaries and asking really hard questions and making really important demands. And I also then worry about how are they protecting themselves and how are they making sure that they are, you know, safe if they want to speak out about Palestine, right, on their university campus. And how do we make sure that we're creating safe spaces for that to happen? I also think we talk about the mental health toll and the stress and how it's, you know, been very prevalent over the past few years, and that, you know, the impact of the pandemic, the impact of George Floyd's murder on the mental well-being of our communities, but we actually haven't done enough, right, to be able to make sure that everyone has access to mental health care that they need to be able to heal and to be whole. And so a lot of my weariness comes from that as well, and knowing that there are so many folks out there who need and deserve more to be healthy, and we're not there yet.
And what I would add to that, so I'm going to do like two things. Hopefully they'll meet together, they'll cross. So first is, in my book, I have an article titled, "Sometimes I Feel Like Harriet Tubman." So probably since the death of Sandra Bland and my sister and I going back and forth of whether or not they took a picture of a dead woman in her police photo, I've always said that's the paradigm that we're in. I'm Harriet Tubman. I'm trying to get my kids free and other people free. When the sister committed suicide at the beginning of the academic year, I think it was from Lincoln University, it's the nostril flare in the side eye. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and I feel like my entire career in academia has been the schism of being the black girl with the double Dutch rope and the bag of candy, giving you the nostril flare, and then trying to assimilate and say, okay, I can do this, right? Not because it's the right thing to do, but I can show you I can play your game and my game. But now when you're watching just the blatant disrespect of African American women who are descendants of African slaves in the media, in the government, in every facet of US American life that we might measure to determine the quality of life, and at the same time you have professional black women, but also everyday black women organizing people to vote, helping literally on the front lines of trying to save the democracy republic, but then you're on this, in the same token, blatantly disrespecting them and allowing them to die. So I'm at the point, like you were saying, tired, weary, nostril flare, and to this point, not knowing, and then again, always paying homage to the ancestors, not knowing what they went through. But here I am, I've played this game, I got this education, I did everything you said I was supposed to do, and yet I'm still dealing with this BS. And so for me, that's where I feel like I'm sitting, and then I feel sorry for myself because you kind of go outside of your body, right? So you talk about mental health, right? There's a physical isolation, but then there's the intellectual isolation, because what you know is true, the rest of the world is saying that's not true. And here I am sitting metaphorically with my bags, with my passports, with my passport cards, thinking, when is it time for me to run? And I thought to myself, how freaking unhealthy is that? Here I am, 5 advanced degrees, associate professor, all these publications, right? I done played your game, and still. And the realization, and I'm gonna hold what I'm saying, right? I'm not trying to put it on you. tired, but then afraid, because I have to ask myself, what did Harriet Tubman have to realize as true in order to run?
Yeah.
What did she have to accept? And what am I sitting here now? Afraid. Because I want to believe that we don't have to die. Right? I want to believe that bodies are not expendable. I want to believe that the system doesn't require certain people to be left out and marginalized in order for other people to have. But I'm at the place where, man, and that's why sometimes, you know, I can only own what I say. It's me, Ty, but I'm sitting here just like you, like WTF, right? Trying to find the language to figure out, try to keep my sanity, try to hold on, still continue to try to play a game, which is what, rigged, right? The cricket room, for which I can never get over. So I feel like that's where I'm at. And again, I'm gonna hold tight, right? I'm not being negative. And then sometimes, you know, and I'm gonna go back to the teacher space, right? Because eye contact, teacher to teacher. I'm just figuring out how I can do what I think is my work, what it is I'm supposed to do, so I can leave something behind so that other people won't fall for the hokey doke, right? Like, folks will know what's going on, so at least I can do that. And that's a jacked up place to be. So I'm not gonna apologize for it, but I hope that was lucid. And with that, I'm not saying I don't have gratitude, but man, you can't ask me to actively participate in my death and be happy about it, and then be okay with the death of other Black women. Like, that's the role we're supposed to play.
Yeah. No, sorry, I have to jump back. No, you just described my the last 5 years of my career, and particularly the last 6 months. You know, I think it's important to realize that it's a game, and the game is rigged. And even when you think you've won, even when you have been named one of the most influential people in the world, in 2024, it does not matter if you are a Black woman talking about racism in the academy. They will still find a way to take you down. They will still find a way to isolate you. They will still find a way to tell you you are not good enough. And they will still find a way to make it clear that your health and your well-being are not a priority. And so one of the things that I keep trying desperately to do, again, for those coming behind me, is to say, if you want to go down this path, do it with your eyes wide open. Create now. I didn't have anyone to tell me. I didn't have anyone that looked like me. So I didn't have anyone to tell me where the landmines were. I didn't have anyone to show me who to be wary of or what questions to ask. I didn't have anyone to tell me, come in with a squad. Like, you have to have a squad. You have to have people, whether they understand the academy or not, you have to have folks who are gonna say, hey, you haven't eaten today, or you're not looking good, because I mean, I think there are so many things that make the difference between thriving and surviving, and I personally have realized that I deserve to thrive, and so trying to figure out how to do that is where personally I am in this journey.
But how challenging it is that the very act of resistance for Black women, right? If anti-Blackness is the seed on which all inequality, at least in the history of the United States, is based on, and Black women are at the crux of that, it's almost as if the very nature to say that I'm going to be happy, I'm going to thrive, I'm going to be myself is oppositional to the structure. It is the most dangerous thing you can do. Then that is like a trip.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm thinking about you. She has that in her book. You say the privilege of emotional well-being are, there's some quotes I wrote down too. The privilege of emotional well-being are left to shape myself from the skin of others. Those are just things that you said in your book. Is beautiful. Like, you should definitely, it's a good reader.
Well, it's all to my mama, who prematurely, like many Black women, died at age 49. But I have to say, if I can leave one lesson, be you. It's not, don't you dare, because there's nothing that's going to satisfy, right? Because once you meet that road, they'll give you another one, right? You is the only brilliance and worth and treasure that you have is who you are from the soul inside out. Don't compromise that at all. And then we just have to figure out, in being ourselves, then how do we build our lives, build our worlds in a way that we can exist. And like we started with, at least for me, I don't have all the answers, but that's what I'm trying to work on and untie that knot, and at least to leave for my daughters and my son a different way of understanding and respecting of what it means to be a Black woman in America, the strength, the legacy, and above all else, do not compromise.
I think that's the gift of healing, right? You heal not just yourself, but also generations to come. And you provide a kind of beacon. That's my goal, right? And I said this on this stage, and I've said it on Twitter, and I've said it in half the things I've written since I left the U. I will avenge all the gray hairs denied my ancestors. Because our deaths are part of the generator of wealth. And we have to redefine well-being and wealth in order for people to understand that that's not a necessity. It is not a necessity for someone else to suffer for you to feel good, right? James Baldwin said it. If I'm not who you say I am, you're not who you think you are. We need people to understand how much their definition of their own success relies on putting other people down, relies on hierarchy, right? Relies on, if I have something, somebody else has to have less. Those equations, and I'm married to a mathematician, those equations aren't true. The world does not have to work that way. And we have traditions of collaboration, reciprocity, sharing, abundance that need to come back to the forefront. Because Harriet Tubman didn't just free herself, she went back. She went back untold times, and there's no computation for how much the spirit she put into that mattered to people. There's no computation for that. You can't put a price on it because we are all priceless.
This whole thing of what does it mean for us to step in the fullness of citizenship, right? What does that look like, right? So then you're right, not only went back and freed others, but then became a spy, and literally without her help would not have saved the Union. So did her democracy piece too, which you see women like Fani Willis, other Black leaders, the former First Lady, women leaders, who I would argue historically they've done that. I think the thing I always struggle with is how seductive, though, the destruction of Black women is in the culture. You know, like The Help, right? This narrative that this is the role you have to play in, and unless you play that role, everything else is out of sync. And how do we break those stories, those narratives? So for example, I have high blood pressure, so when I go to the doctor, you're not managing my death, you're figuring out how that not to be the case, or having fibroids, right? Like all the narratives or the stories that are acceptable, that are seductive, that are commonplace and normalized, so nothing happens to change it. And most of those narratives involve the exploitation, either mentally, emotionally, and physically, of Black women, which one way or another leads to our death. And that seems to be woven into the fabric of American society and culture, even from the way in which Black women are presented in contemporary mainstream culture. So it is a big task. And I always say, how do we untie those knots? You know, I'm untying myself, right? Trying to untie the knot that's me.
Yeah.
But then how do we untie those larger knots? And I feel like that's where I'm at, and asking myself, and that's why I give the disclaimer. I'm saying it today, who knows where I will be tomorrow. I don't know if that's possible in the democracy that we live with today. And I'm all for supporting, you know, I'm very patriotic, so don't hear me saying that, but intellectually, right, you talked about James Baldwin, thinking about Toni Morrison. Is it possible?
It makes me want to get some questions out to Dr. Hardiman, just about your research and the things that you are doing. I often hear you talk about healthcare needing to take into consideration the environments and traumas of the patients, and thinking about like access to food. Are they in a food desert? Is there clean water? Can they walk to how are the schools? Things like that. I'm curious about culture and how it plays a part in mental health, especially with there not being many Black mental health providers. And how do you see a pathway to medicine really becoming preventative, finally? Because I feel like they just put a Band-Aid on the problem a lot, and those are my words. But yeah.
That's a lot.
I know.
That's a lot of questions. And I'm going to start with the last one about how do we shift to prevention, because I think that's the biggest question, the biggest issue, and it requires, in my opinion, it requires us to divest from a capitalist society. We cannot have a healthcare system based on prevention and primary care and also allow the capitalist machine to continue to operate as it does. Because right now, our healthcare system is driven by profit. Yes, there are people and systems that want to do good and are doing good and making sure folks are healthy and have access to whatever they need, but that's not true across the board, right? It's not true in every city, county, state, because there are maternity care deserts, because there are food deserts. There's so many reasons that there are communities that just are going without. And I think that also speaks to another part of your question around, we have to understand that healthcare doesn't just happen within the hospital or clinic or, healthcare delivery setting. Actually, a larger percentage of our health and well-being comes from the social environment in which we live. So whether we live near green space and parks and safe trails to walk and exercise on, or do we live near a incinerator or some other chemical plant that may be pushing toxins into the air and our children are breathing them in. Our research at the Center for Anti-Racism Research for Health Equity has found that for Black women living in Minneapolis, where in neighborhoods where there are higher presence of police, so we're not even talking about police interactions or police violence, but simply being over-surveilled is related or is associated with a greater risk for having a baby too soon, preterm birth. And so we have to be thinking about how all of the ways that our society is structured and how it's impacting health. And that's why for our work and our research, we start with the premise that racism is a fundamental cause of health and health inequities. And so as a result, dismantling racism in all of the ways it shows up, and uncovering all of the hidden ways that racism is embedded in our society is what's going to lead us towards health equity and thus liberation. And so for me, it's been really important to build that evidence base so that we can put it in front of policymakers, community members, community leaders to say, here's how we should be thinking about health and well-being. Our work has allowed us to have some really important conversations about how just simply living in a community where there has been a traumatic event of police violence impacts reproductive health outcomes. And so it's a both and. We have to be working on, access and, what's happening within our healthcare delivery systems, as well as ensuring that people are having opportunities to thrive and be healthy in the communities, the neighborhoods that they live in. And that also means thinking about who gets to buy a home or rent a home and in what communities, and how do we undo the historical vestiges of redlining and other policies that have dictated where folks can live and can't live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dr. Coleman's doing some good work on the racial covenants in the town, in the Twin Cities here. Can we talk about also, Dr. Hardiman, Black women in mental health? Are there any trends or certain diagnoses that are over or underdiagnosed within our community that you can tell us about?
So first, I think it's important to start by understanding something that I think we've kind of all touched upon but haven't actually said, which is this idea of the weathering hypothesis, which was put forth in the early 90s by a professor in Michigan, Arlene Geronimus. And what she found, and the studies are, we can talk about the studies, but that's actually not, I think what's important to understand is that she found that for Black women, we are aging at a faster rate because of the stress due to racism and disadvantage in our society. And so what she found, and this was specific to birth outcomes, was that Black women who were giving birth as teenagers or very young adults actually had better outcomes than their white counterparts. And for white women giving birth in their 20s, they had better outcomes. And so what that led to was a really important understanding around allostatic load, cortisol, all of these stress hormones that over time are just flooding into our bodies. It's that fight or flight system, and it's harmful, especially when it's constant. It's really important, and you want cortisol to kick in if you're being chased by a bear, right? Because that's going to tell you to run and get away and save yourself. But to have those stress hormones flooding your body on a day-to-day basis is really, really harmful for our health and our well-being. So from a health perspective, what that means is we're seeing Black women who, at the age of 45 or younger are facing, chronic issues like type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure or other sort of chronic illnesses that contribute to poor health outcomes. Black women are more likely to be diagnosed with a cardiac issue 5 years younger than their white counterparts. And so we have these chronic illnesses that are, certainly prevalent and contributing to these health inequities. And then you're accessing a healthcare provider who may not understand the impact that racism and inequities and disadvantages had over the life course and what that means. And so then it's, well, why aren't you eating better? Or why aren't you exercising? Rather than saying, let's sit down and holistically think about what's going on here and how we can provide the best care. And then on the mental health side, I won't speak to I can't speak to the sort of the percentages of types of diagnoses. However, we are seeing higher rates of mental health need for Black folks in general and Black women, particularly in the postpartum period. So my research focuses on reproductive health and maternal morbidity and mortality, and what we're seeing in the year, I would say even the couple weeks postpartum, but up to a year, is that there is a great need for postpartum mental health care for Black birthing people or Black women and their families, and very little access is available right now.
How long can postpartum depression last typically, or on average?
It can last, and that's the other thing, is that I think it's so underdiagnosed that, and I think there's like this expectation, well, like hormones and stress and exhaustion and sleep deprivation, and so it's really hard to disentangle. And so it can last beyond a year. It just often goes undiagnosed, or I think a lot of us as mothers are focused on our baby and making sure that they're healthy and aren't taking care of ourselves. We're taking care of everybody else. So one of the things in one of our collaborations with Roots Community Birth Center which is a birth center in North Minneapolis, is that we're thinking about exactly those questions, and how do we better show up and care for the mom and baby as a dyad, right? So, and I think this also speaks to the innovation we could have within our healthcare system, is that we could treat the postpartum period and the mom as part of the family unit and offer a lot more holistic care in that way.
Thank you for that. And just one more question for you too, Dr. Dr. Hardiman, excuse me. There's a lot of doctors up here. working on how doctors see and treat people, I think, well, for me, it would seem incredibly hard because I'd be incredibly intimidated. But many of the providers today that we see more than ever are literally from all over the world, and I'm wondering, how can we inform them of the health disparities that not only define racism, but anti-Blackness? How can you teach this to people that do not have that historical context?
This is one of the big questions that we're grappling with within the research center, our research center right now, because while I believe that education and awareness are incredibly important, they are not, I think we have to be careful not to rely on that as solutions to the problem. So we have, we're in the process right now of evaluating some training modules that our team has created around anti-racism and anti-Black racism in particular, and how it shows up in healthcare delivery and the clinical encounter, and how it impacts maternal health outcomes. And everything for me starts with history. It has to start with a history of the 400 plus years of how racism has been embedded in our ideology, in our framing, in everything we do, in every institution and system that has been built. But I'm also not naive enough to think that 2 or 3 online trainings is going to be enough, right, to help, for all healthcare providers, particularly those who don't have the context of the United States, to learn this. And I think one of the other issues there is that we're expecting some of these folks to learn it on the backs and on the bodies of Black folks, of Black patients, right? Because where you see most of the foreign medical school graduates, for instance, are at some of our, safety net hospitals, where we see a higher rates of people who are racialized as Black, have been mistreated in many ways by many institutions, including the healthcare delivery system. And so, I think just like we wouldn't allow a physician to become a physician in practice without, passing anatomy or physiology or whatever other, thing we deem as pertinent to being a physician, we have to do the same when it comes to health equity, when it comes to the impact of racism on health, when it comes to the history of how Black bodies have been harmed in our healthcare system. So a lot of the work we're doing is really to require that happens in medical education at all different levels. And that's driven by research too, where we found that Black infants, we looked at 1.8 million births across 15 years, and found that Black infants who were cared for by a white physician during the newborn hospitalization phase were twice as likely to die than if they were cared for by a Black physician.
I don't even know what to say about that. That's incredibly sad and devastating. It's violent. So it's hard to switch gears after hearing that, because these are literally babies, and I'm wondering, I'm gonna pivot, I think. With the current political climate, and seeing how laws are being changed in places like Florida that that are affecting how you can teach, what you can teach in academia especially. I'm just wondering how concerned you all are as educators. You're still educator, Dr. Squires. You can't change it. But how concerned are you, and what are your thoughts on just the current climate and how things are right now in the United States?
Very concerned, and it's sometimes really it's galling to think of how much hypocrisy there is around the freedom to learn and the freedom to speak. And actually, even though you're framing this as a pivot, I don't see it as a pivot. When you have kids reading and learning about people of different cultures, different races, different backgrounds in a humanizing way because they're reading novels and histories and fun books that feature black and brown kids, you're further humanizing us. And those doctors who neglected black babies didn't see them as our kids, right? When the civil rights movement desegregated spaces like swimming pools, many white communities decided not just to not attend the public pool anymore, they filled them in with concrete so nobody could use it anymore. So that kind of viciousness is what I see today in the book bans and the so-called anti-woke laws. It's that viciousness that says, my identity and my sense of myself and my community is so disconnected from any human vision of you. I want to destroy you. I want to erase you if you try to do anything but be subservient to me. That's the kind of viciousness. When you have people playing around with Nazi slogans and they are major candidates for office, and people do the both sidesism on it in the media, that is absolutely terrifying to me. It's absolutely terrifying to me that people cloak this under the words that they're trying to protect their children from feeling bad about themselves, and they're okay with our children being shot in the street. That's what I think is terrifying. That even having a fun book that humanizes a black or brown child is seen as a threat to their child's sense of self. To me, that just says, you want your child to feel superior to my child.
Or this desperation to maintain a century system of racialized oppression and hierarchy. So you can almost argue that it's an attempt at desperation, and I too agree with you, it's not a pivot. If I could bring the black baby who's less likely to survive after being served, and I'm going to be generous by the well-meaning white constructed physician who has no ideal that they're killing the child. If I have the book, if I have the history, you replay that scene and then you can see how the doctor is killing the baby. Yep. And that's why we don't want to have the history. That's why we don't want to have the knowledge, because as we see the demographics changing, as people well-intentioned recognize, something needs to change. We can't change it without the history. You can't have that, because then you'll see. I think about it as a Dr. Moore, who was the sister who had COVID, who was the physician, who was telling her physicians desperately, very astutely, what she needed to survive. And I'm sorry, COVID didn't kill her, racism killed her. And why did she die? Because she was too difficult and outspoken. And then that narrative sits on the shelf, and then we've rendered another murder of a black woman body invisible. But if I have the history, if I tell you about incidents in the life of a slave girl, if we study slavery, if we look at the domesticity of black women and how that has killed them, we understand that Dr. Moore was not acting in line with the capitalistic product. So then it's easy then to recognize her murder, to categorize it as such, and then work to change the policies and procedures so then it doesn't happen again. So I would argue that we're at a precipice, because by the time you get people saying we can't read books, we can't do this, that's a symptom of a deeper systemic disease. And it's a symptom of a system fighting to maintain control. And then we have to decide with the various gifts and talents we have, because let me be clear, Dr. Moore did not deserve to die, but no one, no matter who you are, deserves to die. What are we going to do in our own way to contribute to the dismantling of that system in order for us to survive? And I think that's why I write, right? To take those moments that seem sweet and innocent, and if I can slow it down and pull it out and blow it up, and let me show you what's really happening in that exchange, maybe we can start to see, and then do the work that we can to shift it in our own ways. And I know it's a lot, but imagine if we all shifted it together, the kind of pressure we would bring to bear to create something new. And I want to go back to anti-blackness. I myself too, I don't think I have the subject position to speak on this, But I want to say that anti-Blackness is global. And with the influence of colonization, imperialism, the influence of the West, it doesn't look the same. The bodies aren't the same, but this notion that there's always a Black body that needs to be at the bottom of the hierarchy, I would say, is global. And that's something we also have to deal with.
I think that's really important because I think the fact that we don't talk about that enough, it's divisive, right? It allows us to stay in our lane, and by taking that global perspective, there's so much power in it. And also to your earlier comment, Ty, I think we're seeing this backlash, and it's not just Florida and Texas, it's creeping up right here, in this very state that we live in. And for me, I think I try to remind myself every day, it's happening because we're on to something. Because what you just beautifully described is like slowing it down and blowing it out and saying, here's the history, here. So more and more folks are doing that. And as a result, there's always gonna be that backlash and that pushback. And I think it's gonna get worse as we get closer and closer to November in this next election. And so, for me, it's figuring out what's the collective strategy? What is it that we are gonna do collectively to both protect the work that's already been done, but also not lose ground?
Yeah, and that's where I think co-conspirators are so important. Yeah. And I think some people have taken themselves out of the game because they have a oversimplified idea of what it means to let other people speak their truth. Right? So I think what I've seen and I've experienced as a teacher and facilitating workshops is that, people who do understand the structural, people who do understand that it's important to be anti-racist, people who do want to make change also don't speak out for fear of saying it wrong or overstepping. And guess what? We all make mistakes. We are not perfect, to your point earlier, and silence can be as violent as the people who are throwing the invectives and trying to do the book bans on the other side, because it manufactures a sense that the loudest people in the room are the only people in the room, and they're the true majority, and that is exactly how fascism works.
Say that again. I have one more question, and then we're going to want to take questions from you, audience, if you do have questions. And I think it kind of goes to what you're saying, Dr. Squires, about co-conspirators. I know for me, after COVID and the uprising, the sisterhood that I've been able to grow within my community of Black women has been something beautiful to witness, and that I don't think was as strong before that. And I'm just wondering, do you have a sisterhood, and how has that held you down now? Whoever wants to go.
I can start. Yes, I have a sisterhood. It starts with my twin sister, Simone. And I'm smiling because about a month ago, I was not in a good place. And I was supposed to go to lunch with my sisters, my biological sister, and 4 or 5 other girlfriends who every month every month on a Friday we get together for a self-care lunch. Sometimes we throw a massage in there, and we have cocktails and we spend the afternoon together. And it was one of those Fridays, and I called my sister and I said, I can't go. A bunch of really disturbing things had happened at work, and I was distraught. And I said, I can't go because I can't pretend that I'm okay, and I don't want to talk about it. And she said, okay, I understand. And then, I hung up, and I got in the shower, and then I got out of the shower, and my sister and all of our girlfriends, our squad, were at my door. With food, with wine. 5 Black women sitting in my bed, literally sitting in my bed, brainstorming, supporting, praying, loving me. And it was one of the first times for me where I actually just finally like released and like let myself be cared for and loved. I see myself as the caretaker, and so to be in that moment and to be able to receive it was just as important as all the other pieces of what was, what was happening in that space. And I realized then that again, like it just reinforced for me, we can't do this work in isolation. We have to have our people to pick us up. And it just, the rest of that weekend, there was somebody there every day, phone calls, it is one of the most, it's something that I will remember forever. And also that I'm grateful that my daughter got to see how that played out, so that when she needs her squad, she's gonna have it.
Mm-hmm. And if I could also add, and you guys met two of my squad, they're in the room, but also I want to say it's difficult too sometimes, because I found as being the only coming into institutions, which to me didn't start when I acquired my tenure track position. I felt that way even as a graduate student. And I have a really great friend, Ebony Adams. She lives in California. I'm calling her out. We both finished the PhD program, but it's probably not until our last year that we stopped being afraid of each other. We used to see each other and we used to say hello. And I think sometimes, at least for the fear that I felt as a black person, right, there's this fear, you don't know how you're going to be received, that you're even afraid of someone who looks like you, and that's true internalized oppression. So we kind of circled around each other, we sniffed each other, and then we finally, it's like, oh, you're great, I love you, right? And now my 22-year-old, right, who's just graduated from college, she held her when she was a baby, and I thought of all the years we wasted because we let that fear keep us from each other. So also too, holding that space for trying to develop that sisterhood, but also giving yourself permission to feel. And lately I've really been thinking about this notion of, as black women, we do have feelings, we do love, we are gentle, we are kind, right? Because so much is it about being hard and having that hard shell. And I think part of facilitating that group is trying to work through that, if that's something that you carry, however you have it. And I just want to name it, having spent so long overlooking sisters who could have been my lifeline, but because of my own fear or internalized racism, that oftentimes we are different, right? Because no identity is a monolith, but that sister that you're in close proximity to, that you're circling around, right, like in the universe, can be the person who could also help you save yourself. And as you're saving yourself, you're also saving them. Yeah, because like this society, racism is a trip, right? It keeps us from ourselves and from other black women who are like us too.
No, it's so important to have your squad. And I wouldn't have left academia if I hadn't had a squad, including my birth sister, but also, being one of the first and the only amongst a very small group of full black professors at the University of Minnesota. It was part of my own practice to try and create spaces for us to come together. And so when we recruited the now new dean of the Humphrey School, not so new, but Dean Nisha Boshwe, I said, I'm going to gather some people for you to meet so you can see that we're actually here, because that's really important for people to know that there would be a place to land. And that group has continued to meet and morph in different ways. And because I started that for her, and she came into it so well, when I made my decision to leave, I felt like she wouldn't feel like I was abandoning her.
Yep.
And that was probably the only thing keeping me there as long as it was to help her transition. And so it was a really beautiful, bittersweet moment when I told her that I was going to leave, and we both cried and all these sorts of things, but she knew exactly why I was leaving, and she knew exactly why it was healthy for me, and she did not resent me for it one iota, and that made it so much easier for me to make the transition and, validate my decision again.
Thank you again, panel. I just wanted to ask our audience, do you have any questions? And if you do, I'd love to make my way down. I'll come over first and then I'll come to you. Is that okay?
Good morning. My name is Dietrich, and it's really, really important for me to hear your stories, and because they're so reflective of my own and probably others in the room. I am 23-year-old public Montessori teacher in St. Paul. I left and went on leave so I could work on my PhD at the U. I resonate with all of you who have stories about University of Minnesota, or how your eyes glaze over when you talk about the University of Minnesota. Because just in my second year, I just completed my second year. Thank you. And the person who actually helped me stay there was Dr. Lisa Clarkson, who just became an associate professor in my program. The question I have for you it has to do with mental health, because that's kind of the work that I've been working on as a Montessori teacher, with my own practice, and with my own children, and trying to just get at sort of the nub of the rub, as my husband says, about how we can make a difference for those who are coming after us. And so there was a journal article I just read about, it was about apocalyptic education, but the whole thing was about having, preparing children young, preparing Black, brown, and indigenous children young, fortifying them with all of the mental health strategies and tools and wellness that they need, so that as they move through an educational system. Well, for one thing, the article said, we need to move past the educational system that we're in and create something different for those children. That the American public school system is dead, is what the article said. So, my question is what is your opinion about that with this quote? The quote that struck me was, Black women with PhDs have a lower life expectancy than white women who don't graduate high school. So I'm just curious about what you feel about starting them young, and about that.
I don't have expertise in that field, but for me, I think that sounds about right? I have a PhD. When I have an essay in the book about prematurely losing a daughter at 18 weeks, and in doing my research at the time to write the essay, I found that Black women who are educated are more likely to experience fetal death, and mortality. So no, I think that's true. Again, from my own experience, so I can only stay with you in solidarity. In terms of mental health, I also don't think I can be an expert on that, but I can say that I started to write about my experiences. I started to validate my experience, and writing and journaling became a way to validate. But I also am not going to lie to you, there were times that I just walked away. When I finished my ABD, I literally left the country and lived someplace for 2 years because I had to decide if I could, and I'm sorry, I don't want to stereotype every person who is in academia, but from what I saw, I didn't want to reinscribe that violence onto someone else. So I'm just trying to figure out how to navigate my way. I'm going to say, if that's what you want to do, you are worth it. So whatever you do, don't let them turn you around. Do your playlist, your gospel songs, whatever you have to do to get through. We need you, but I can just say yes. Everything you say resonates with me, and then my thing was to figure out, how can I survive in that world if that's what I want to do? Can I do good things in that world? And as long as those things can be in balance, then maybe I can figure out a way to survive and do my work. And I feel like I'm assessing that literally on a daily or weekly basis. And I also say that's okay, right? You still get to determine what you want to do, how you want to move in this space. But almost everything you say is the reason why I started writing. So I just know that I stand with you. Thank you.
I would just add, I think the quote that you shared is exactly right. I mean, and I can say that from a personal perspective, as someone with a PhD who feels like, actually not feels, I am certain I have been fighting for my life for the past few years, literally fighting for my life. And also from a scientific perspective, as a reproductive health researcher, we see time and time again that Black birthing people, despite their socioeconomic standing, so you can have as many of the highest degrees in the world, and you are still going to be at greater risk for a adverse birth outcome in comparison to a white woman who has not graduated from high school. We have to recognize that it's socioeconomic status is not, and education is not going to save us. It is undoing structural, institutional, systemic racism as well as internalized racism. And so for me, going into doctoral training, I had no intentions of going into academia. That was not actually my initial plan. But as I was preparing to, and thinking more about what was next, I kept looking around and I was like, how come I have never taken a class during my master's degree, during my PhD that was taught by someone who looked like me? And I think for many of us, the reason that we do this work is because we saw a problem and we knew we knew what we wanted to do to fix it or to help be a part of the solution. And I decided that I wanted to be a part of the solution and figured, if not me, then who? And decided to, pivot into academia. What I realize now is, and I don't regret, I have zero regrets. And also, I think you have to be very clear about how much you're willing to sacrifice and where does that line up with who you are, the life you want, the values that you hold. Because I think going in knowing very clearly what all of that is for you allows you to navigate those pathways a lot more safely. And I mean, when I say, it's mental and emotional safety.
I'll say all those things. And to the point of the little ones, right? Thinking about your kids in school. That's really hard, right? I agree with the journal article that you quoted that the system is failing. It's been failing lots of students. It hasn't just been failing Black and brown students. Students with disabilities, queer students, it's been failing lots of students. And it's been failing the so-called high-performing students who have a higher rates of anxiety and depression and isolation. And so I think the same thing for young kids is the same thing for PhD students. Where's their sense of community coming from? If you're over-dependent on a predominantly white educational institution for your sense of belonging, and you're a Black or brown kid, that's a recipe for disaster, right? And so where is your sense of belonging coming from, and where do you have enough safe spaces? Do you have enough affirming spaces? Do you have enough windows and mirrors in your life outside of school, if your school's not doing a good job with that, to make up for some of the harm you're gonna get? And one of the most important things for me when I was a kid coming into semi-integrated schools in the 70s was seeing my parents and a coalition of parents fight for a school that was better for us. We lost the fight, the school got closed. But seeing them fight for us was so important, and that memory got me through a lot of other more really ugly moments of schooling. Right? I knew I loved to learn, but I also knew I hated school. But I at least knew that I loved to learn and that it was possible. And I think our kids need to know that while we're working out the systemic part.
And as an educator, you might benefit. It's dated, but I think it's totally relevant. Derek Bell's legal journal article, Interest Convergence, responding 25 years past the board, Brown versus Board of Education, and why it hadn't worked. And I think in some ways, Derek Bell and his brilliance kind of unties the anti-Blackness of public education, which I think is the reason why it's not working today. But in some sense, as a spider web, in a sense, shows why everything is not working today. And maybe that could give you some solace, because if you're like I was when I was a PhD candidate, I spent every day saying to myself, Ty, you're not crazy. Like, there's nothing wrong with the way you're seeing things. And so then know that there are texts and writers out there that I think you might find resonate with you. And Derek Bell is a place, in terms of history, where I would recommend starting. And if you want to talk, email me. I'll give you a pep talk. You're not in isolation.
Aww.
No, and as I tell you, there were people who did the same thing to me, right? We help each other through. Harriet Tubman each other through. And I'm excited because we need you. Okay.
I'm just so glad to be here. This has been fantastic. My name is Rashaya G. I am currently the Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Minnesota Law School, a job I have resigned from for a lot of the reasons we've talked about, and I will just be a VAP, a visiting associate professor at the law school. In the fall, I teach critical race theory, so I'm happy to give you the Derek Bell article she talked about, and also the Serving Two Masters article is fantastic for that. I also have an apocalyptic question, so thank you for broaching it so that it doesn't come from me directly, that I think is reflective of what so many of you have said, and kind of what you just said, which is that it very much feels like the nation is cannibalizing itself, in part because the identity is contingent upon this kind of subjugation that's just unsustainable, right? And so because the nation's identity is predicated on this kind of tiered humanity system where part of the society understands its worth, value, and sense of self on the subjugation of another part of the society, you create these systems where schools die, where healthcare is unsustainable because you're fueled by this. What I think is causing me the most amount of mental health stress at this point is this kind of twofold reality where it feels like the society is cannibalizing itself, partially because of white grievance and backlash and the anti-Blackness that it's predicated on, but no one's talking about either what feels like a collapse or the driving force behind it, which is a lot of this anti-Blackness. And then the people who are talking about it are often the people who are trying to survive this anti-Blackness, to get their kids through school, to find, reputable healthcare providers. And so especially in academia, it feels like people have the historical context, have the tools, have the platform, and yet they're asking me, like, so your jurisprudence framework for the First Amendment and emojis, and I'm like, I don't know if you saw, but Trump said he's not gonna give up the office in 12 years, and people are talking about a civil war being necessary, and we're looking at global war, and we're also in an existential crisis as it relates to climate and inflation, and our educational system is collapsing, and we're like, so I'm happy to talk to you about jurisprudence, but also, I don't know if you saw it's burning outside, and no one's having that conversation. And so I'm just not sure, right? Like, I don't wanna be the one in the faculty meeting like, hey, what's our plan for civil war? And also, this feels like a huge source of, like you said, when do I run, right? Should I be looking at citizenship in some other country? Should I be building a bunker? Should I be like, what are my plans? So I'm not sure if there is a strategy.
Well, I cannot be objective, and it's in my book. Like, I feel like I'm always running. I think Dr. Hardiman said that too. I knew that when I started using plantation analogies or metaphors to explain my daily job. That's what I'm saying. So my sister, she was like, where's my ID? I lost my plantation pass. And we're like, so we're laughing, but it's real. So I feel like I educate my children. I try to, in my privilege, give them every advantage I can. In my house, we're so nerds. We're talking about news, and I don't want to scare them, but what I think is appropriate and what they could handle. There's a wonderful documentary, is it called Lowndes County? Where Ruby Sales says at the end of the documentary, brilliant, she says, we just wanted to have what they had. We just wanted to vote. We just wanted to do this. But now that she has this long view, she says, but we never stopped to ask ourselves what it meant to join a house that was already on fire. And my hair stood on end. So I would say, that's what I think about, and then I also say, well, what privilege and arrogance did I think as a U.S. American citizen that wouldn't happen here, right? Who am I to think that we should have that luxury of stability? And then third, as a scholar of literature, right, and cultural history, slave narratives is my thing. I would argue we have never left 1862. We are still there, and now you have people who are blatantly and explicitly comfortable with saying it. So we're no longer going to be invisible. So maybe it's us just accepting that these are choices that people have. And it's hard when we've been educated. I would say, my traditional education never allowed to see that as a reality. So the only thing I can say is that I'm here, I'm doing my work, I try to be positive, but yes, acknowledging that that's where we're at. I think of our ancestors, the Middle Passage, right, that what they survived, and not that I'm justifying pain and suffering, but I also want to say that we're strong, we're hopeful, we have gifts, there are people fighting, and I'm excited. I'm not going to lay down and die, so just as I work to save my life and the life of my children, I'm also invested, in a democracy republic where people and everyone can be free and equitable. So And I think we can do two things. I can see that the house is on fire, but I'm working to put it out too. Because where are you going to run to? I think COVID taught us that. Where are you going to go? Mm-hmm. So here we are, and that's not a bad thing. So like I told my sister here, right. Right, but I also like to take it to a spiritual level if I can. We're connected whether we want to realize it or not, right? Because the lie is that we're separated, that we're in isolation. The truth is we just decided we was going to meet up today, but we've been together all along, you know? So that's how I like to think about it. When I forget, your friend group reminds you. So, but I want to validate, you're not the only one that sits around and thinks about that. I do too.
Ditto. I think you said it beautifully. You don't need to add to that.
I'll just say, I'll add Adrienne Marie Brown to our conversation today.
Yes.
She said that in her book, Emergent Strategy, that sometimes she feels like she's living in someone else's ancestors' dreams, and that dream didn't include her, or it included her only as a subordinate. But it also brings to mind that the power of imagination and imagining otherwise is that unless we start to imagine what we want, we will continue to live out the nightmare that someone else imagined for us. And so I think of all the brilliance in this room and all the brilliance next to me and the way that folks are reimagining what could be and giving people, I forget if it was, I can't remember the writer who said it, but she said, we have to make the revolution so delicious, so irresistible.
Yes.
Is it Toni Cade Bambara? Yes. I can't remember. Yes, Toni Cade Bambara. She said, we have to make the thing that's on the other side of that revolution so beautiful that people are no longer afraid of change, right? People are gripping onto these zombie identities. Mm-hmm. And it's like, no, don't eat brains. Use your brain. Come on now, we need all the brains we can get.
I love that. Don't eat brains, use your brain.
Thank you so much.
Zombie apocalypse. I had to bring it in.
And it connects to slavery, right?
Thank you so much for not eating brains, but using your brains. Thank you again, Dr. Squires, Dr. Coleman, and Dr. Hardeman for being here today. Once again, I'm Andrea Pierre. I'm station manager at KRSM Radio. We are low power FM in South Minneapolis. You can find us at www.krsmradio.org. And thank you, First Universalist Church, Minnesota Women's Press, Mickey, just for the invitation to be here. This was just a blast and such an honor to be here. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, and I know we're running late, so I want to just let everybody go, but I do want to say, yeah, that was a fantastic conversation. I'm very eager to get it pieced together and edited as video. We'll share it out, and everybody should share it with their communities. So we do have the latest issue of the magazine, which is about values and vision. Out, as well as some copies left of the mental health issue, and University of Minnesota Press has Ty's book. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for moderating. Great questions. My goodness. Thank you.